Please welcome Larry A. Meisel, founder of The Cell, and Norm Brownstein, chairman of Brownstein, Hyatt, Farber, and Schreck.
I'd like to take a moment and thank the governor and mayor for hosting this event every year. It's so important that our leaders are here and really delivering a beautiful message that we know and sensitize us that 9/11 deals not only with where we are here, but also for our country. Our spirit of resiliency challenged us to find a new way to keep our country safe, and that is why we found The Cell, in order to be able to communicate and educate, and we're dedicated to this as part of our commitment to our community. And I hope that you will continue to engage with us in making this a better and a safer world. And we hope to continue to engage with us to our next coming event, which would be Secretary Panetta and Senator Udall on October 17th. And now I'd like to take a moment to recognize our sponsors who deserve our appreciation for making tonight's event possible. Our presenting sponsor, the Denver Post, and Dean Singleton, who has been the visionary behind this event and understands the significance of remembering this day. Our pioneer sponsor, the Colorado Oil and Gas Association. First Banks, our associate sponsor, and of course, the University of Denver and the Newman Center. It's now my pleasure to welcome Norman Brownstein.
Thank you. It's an exceptional privilege for me to be able to introduce these two esteemed guests and the moderator, of course. I have known Joe Lieberman and Jane Harman since the first days they entered the United States Senate and the United States Congress. And it has been an incredible experience for me to see the contributions that they have made to those institutions and this country over the years from, in Joe's case, from 1988, and in Jane's case, 1992, the year of the woman. These two individuals have been recognized as two of the most thoughtful and informed American leaders and influencers on international and homeland security. Our first panelist, the Honorable Joe Lieberman, served the state of Connecticut for 24 years. Mr. Lieberman was the leading proponent of the creation of the Department of Homeland Security and an important contributor to the legislation that created that department and changed forever the United States national security apparatus. He is regarded throughout the world as a foremost expert on all aspects of security and foreign policy. Mr. Lieberman currently serves as senior counsel at Kasowitz, Benson, Torres, and Friedman in New York City, and also co-chairs the Bipartisan Coalition for American Security. Please welcome my dear friend, the Honorable Joe Lieberman. Our next honored guest, the Honorable Jane Harman, was the U.S. representative from California's 36th District for over 15 years. While in public office, she served on the House Committee on Homeland Security, the House Armed Services Committee, and the Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. Congresswoman Harman is widely considered one of the leading experts on intelligence issues and security policy. She now serves as the Director, President, and CEO of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington. Please welcome the Honorable Jane Harman. Now it is my esteemed pleasure to turn this event over to our moderator, and join me in welcoming Vince Carroll, he's editorial page editor of the Denver Post. Thank you.
Thanks, Norm. It's a great honor for me to be here as well tonight with these two distinguished panelists. That was an extremely moving ceremony a few minutes ago, and it does really bring back some of the emotions of that time. We're here tonight not only to honor those lives lost on September 11th, 2001, though, but also to reflect back on the dramatic changes that occurred in the wake of it, and to consider the continuing threats of terrorism, both domestic and foreign. As was referenced just a moment ago, one of the biggest and immediate changes was the creation of the Department of Homeland Security. Through the consolidation of 22 federal agencies, it amounted to the most significant transformation of the federal bureaucracy since the creation of the Department of Defense some 60 years earlier. Both of our panelists were there and very instrumental in that transformation. To steal the famous words of Dean Acheson from another context, they were present at the creation. And so their insights are going to be particularly valuable. We'll cover a range of issues from, as I say, the reconstruction of the federal bureaucracy to deal with intelligence and national security, what their goals were, where they think they succeeded, they and their colleagues, that is to say, and also perhaps where they didn't succeed or it didn't turn out quite the way they expected. We will also, as I mentioned, discuss ongoing terrorism threats, both domestic and foreign. And we will not neglect, I assure you, in the latter minutes of this first hour to solicit their views on the ongoing crisis in Syria. So why don't we begin? Senator Lieberman, why don't you tell us, first just take us back, where were you on 9/11, and how soon was it before you sensed that we needed to do something quite radical with the federal bureaucracy regarding intelligence and domestic security?
Thank you, Vince. And before I remember where I was on 9/11, I want to thank Colorado for remembering 9/11 tonight in this moving ceremony. To thank Larry Meisel and Courtney and Dean Singleton and everybody else involved for your leadership. To thank Norm Brownstein for being Norman. What more could you say, right? And a special thanks to the men and women in uniform and out of uniform who serve America in our military, or as first responders, because we will only continue to be the land of the free so long as we are also the home of the brave, and you are the brave who protect us every day. God bless you. Thank you. So on 9/11/01, typical morning, I had 2 breakfasts to go to. I actually had 3 breakfasts to go to, but I only got to the first 2. When I came out of the first one, which was a meeting with people in the postal direct mail business, I heard on the radio that a plane had hit one of the World Trade Center towers. And my first thought was, oh my God, I hope it's not terrorism. No, it's probably a small plane, which happens sometimes. It goes off the track, or the pilot has a heart attack or something of that kind. So I went into the second meeting, which a congressman from North Carolina had come over and asked me to talk to a Chamber of Commerce delegation. And when I came out of that meeting, somebody told me that another plane had hit the Second World Trade Center, and then of course I knew it was terrorism. And I went back to my office, and I can tell you that there was chaos on Capitol Hill. I mean, we were totally unprepared for that moment. Nobody knew what to do or where to go. People were pouring out of their offices, standing in the streets and parks. I remember going down and I asked my staff to try to get home if they could, or go to a friend on Capitol Hill. I went downstairs, saw the first Capitol policeman I could see, and said, do you have any idea what we should be doing? And he said, let me call headquarters. And then he said, go over to the headquarters. I mean, today, of course, there are plans for what to do. By the end of the day, that evening, as Jane will probably remember, a large group of members of the House and Senate stood together on the steps of the Capitol and sang together powerfully at that moment of shock, God Bless America. So I was heartbroken, stunned, and I will say to you that the emotion that really took over my reaction to 9/11 in a matter of a couple of days was anger. Anger that these fanatics were able to do that damage to our great country, and how could they have done it? And to resolve, because I was ranking member at that time, I guess, of a committee that was an investigative committee that had shown some interest in terrorism, that I would do whatever I could in the years that followed to try to fix what had gone wrong, to close the vulnerabilities that existed. And I just had a great privilege during that time to work with Susan Collins, later with Jane Harman, actually first with Fred Thompson and then Susan Collins, to introduce the legislation that became the Homeland Security Department, later introduced with John McCain the legislation to create the 9/11 Commission, and then with Jane and Susan and I forgot Hoekstra's first name. Pete Hoekstra from Michigan formed the foursome that got it done pretty quickly, and as Vince has said, it represented the most significant change in our national security apparatus since the end of the Second World War and the beginning of the Cold War, for an obvious reason, which is that we had begun a new chapter in our security history as a result of the terrorist attacks on us on 9/11. Here in Colorado, I do want to say that the idea of a Department of Homeland Security didn't spring ab initio from my brain. It actually originated earlier in 2001 from a commission which was headed by the late Warren Rudman, a wonderful senator, former senator at that point from New Hampshire, and Gary Hart, a former senator from the state of Colorado, who suggested that something like the Department of Homeland Security was necessary. So it's a pleasure to be here tonight in Colorado to pay tribute to Gary Hart for his prescience.
Congresswoman, take us back.
Well, first of all, just like Joe, who, by the way, is a dear friend, you will see that, I want to thank Colorado and Governor Hickenlooper and the mayor and Larry and Norm and others for asking me to share something that is very special. The notion that all of you are here only for the reason of remembering and resolving is important, and I'm honored to be part of this. I'd like to start with 9/10/2001 because it's relevant. I had served for 2 years on the National Commission on Terrorism. It was one of 3 commissions, like Hart-Rudman, that had been set up to study the terrorism threat against the United States. And we had predicted that there would soon be a major attack on U.S. soil based on the work we had done, both in the U.S. and travels around the world, including to the Middle East. On 9/10/2001, I had lunch on Capitol Hill with Jerry Bremer, L. Paul Bremer. Some of you may know who he is. He's a former ambassador. He was the first person we sent into Iraq. That chapter was somewhat controversial, his chapter there. After we had concluded our military activity, well, we didn't conclude it, had entered the country, let's leave it there. At any rate, Jerry and I are good friends in different parties. We were having lunch to bemoan the fact that no one was paying attention to our recommendation. I want to thank Colorado and Governor Hickenlooper and the mayor and Larry and Norm and others for asking me to share something that is very special. The notion that all of you are here only for the reason of remembering and resolving is important, and I'm honored to be part of this. I'd like to start with 9/10/2001 because it's relevant. I had served for 2 years on the National Commission on Terrorism. It was one of 3 commissions, like Hart-Rudman, that had been set up to study the terrorism threat against the United States. And we had predicted that there would soon be a major attack on U.S. soil based on the work we had done, both in the U.S. and travels around the world, including to the Middle East. On 9/10/2001, I had lunch on Capitol Hill with Jerry Bremer, L. Paul Bremer. Some of you may know who he is. He's a former ambassador. He was the first person we sent into Iraq. That chapter was somewhat controversial, his chapter there. After we had concluded our military activity, well, we didn't conclude it, had entered the country, let's leave it there. At any rate, Jerry and I are good friends in different parties. We were having lunch to bemoan the fact that no one was paying attention to our recommendation. The next morning at 9 a.m. or shortly before, I was walking toward the Capitol to a meeting in the dome of the Capitol. That is then where the Intelligence Committee rooms were. They've since been moved to what's called the Capitol Visitor Center in a bunker, basically, way underground. But at that time, that's where they were. And my office called and said that the House office buildings had closed, and so had the Capitol. And we milled around, as Joe said, and we were all speculating that the dome of the Capitol, where I had been heading, was the intended target of the plane that went down in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. No emergency plan, no path forward. It was shocking that the United States Congress was so unprepared. And I think, Joe, one little addition to what you said, we did come together finally at 5 o'clock or so to sing God Bless America. It was a poignant and special moment. But it also was the moment when the Capitol buildings reopened. It was a mistake to close them, looking back on it. How could our government close at a time like that in America? Fast forward over these various bills, we all worked closely together. And it's fun to think that Joe and Susan Collins and I became this hearty little band. We still are friends. And it goes to show that tripartisanship works. Susan is a Republican, I'm a Democrat, and Joe, last time I asked, is an independent. And it's wonderful. The legislation we passed wasn't perfect, but under all the circumstances, it was pretty damn good. And the Homeland Department, looking back, is a very ambitious concept. It wasn't Joe's original concept. His original concept was a White House coordinator and a smaller group of agencies, more like the concept we enacted for intelligence reform, where the Director of National Intelligence is basically a joint commander over a number of agencies, but they're not all together with the same arm badges in one building. But we embraced that concept because the White House proposed it, that version, and we knew it would pass. Intelligence reform was another hurdle because, first of all, the intelligence agencies were set up in 1947, and no business model, as Larry and Norm know, no business model from 1947 could possibly be relevant to 2004, which it then was. So we reorganized that over the implacable opposition of the then Secretary of Defense, Don Rumsfeld, and the then chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, Duncan Hunter. We had a bipartisan, tripartisan group in favor of it, and George Bush was in favor of it. And it was a very proud moment to be there when the bill was signed. And I think, though both things are works in progress, our country is much better off because of the steps we took.
Describe what some of the goals were, though. Wasn't the purpose in part to break down barriers between agencies, to get them out of their silos, and to facilitate communication? Did it work? I mean, is it to some degree or to a great degree?
Right, let me go to the goals. What was clear very shortly after 9/11, and really frustrating and infuriating, was that there were different government agencies that had information about these 19 terrorist attackers on 9/11, but one didn't know what the other had. And in a larger sense, that we had tremendous resources that could protect our homeland in this new period of vulnerability of our people at home, really unprecedented in our history with very few exceptions. You got to go back to the War of 1812 or the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor that started the Second World War. The idea was to bring these agencies together, overcome the stovepipes, have them working together, sharing information in the common interest. And the metaphor that took hold at that time was simplistic, but it was generally accurate, which is that there were dots all around. And because they weren't on the same board, they weren't connected in time to prevent the attackers of 9/11. So clearly one goal was to create first a single agency that would be, the sum would be greater than the whole of the parts because of the interactions. That would be the Department of Homeland Security, and always, as Jane says, knew it would be a work in progress. And then the second was to reform the intelligence agencies, which really, I mean, they were not sharing information with one another. The FBI and the CIA, for instance, seemed in a kind of competition. And one of the new agencies we created, which is really an unsung gem in our national homeland defense, is called the National Counterterrorism Center. And it brings together in one place, I mean, you'd think you were watching, 24 or Homeland. This place really exists. In one place, all the agencies are in our government that have 24/7 had anything to do with Homeland Security. They share information. I'll never forget when it opened up, Susan Collins and I went out one day, and the then first director of the National Counterterrorism Center took us around, and he said at one point, "Now I want to point this out to you, senators. Here's the area where the FBI representatives sit, and here's the area where the CIA representatives sit. And notice, there is not only not a door, but not a wall between these people." Well, I mean, that said a lot. And as a result, I think it's not perfect, but as a result, we're a lot safer than we were on 9/11. I think we've achieved a lot of the goals. I don't want to belabor this, but there were agents, great parts of American government, like the Coast Guard, which largely had a maritime protection role. But we realized after 9/11 that they also could have an enormously expanded Homeland Security role. They became part of the Homeland Security Department, and they're now protecting our coasts in a way that just didn't exist before, also sharing information that they have with other constituent groups like Immigration and Naturalization, Customs and Border Protection, TSA, to the benefit of all of us. So by and large, I think the goals have been met. I mean, you got to say bottom line, we certainly have not had another successful mass terrorist attack like 9/11 since 9/11.
Not to belabor too much on bureaucracy, because we may have topics that are more interesting to some of the audience to come, but what is your assessment? Because from an outside perspective, when you look at an agency with 240,000 employees, and the Washington Post recently did a series in which they looked at how many federal, state, and local agencies have something to do with intelligence and counterterrorism. They counted more than 4,000, 900 of which were created post 9/11. It seems like almost an unmanageable situation. So what's your assessment?
Well, I think it's a work in progress. Mm-hmm. I think the Homeland Security Department is a work in progress. I testified this morning, I was telling Joe, before the Senate Homeland Committee, which he used to chair. Susan Collins was the ranking member. The new chairman is Tom Carper of Delaware, and the ranking member is Tom Coburn of Oklahoma. But I was with Thad Allen, who was the Coast Guard admiral in charge of the Coast Guard on 9/11. And Coast Guard played a major role, not connected to all these other agencies on 9/11. It was quite stunning. And on the, at the BP oil spill and some other events in our history. But we were all talking, and with Tom Ridge this morning, who was the first Secretary of Homeland Security. We were talking about unfinished business. Let me just make a couple of comments. The NCTC, which Joe mentioned, the National Counterterrorism Center, it's an amazing place, but it was a slow start. I remember going there and seeing under the desks 7 or 8 different hard drives and asking, what is all this mess? Why can't you have some simpler technology? Well, guess what? We had 7 or 8 different databases, different classification systems, different separated information strains, which we had to integrate in order to understand what the threats to our country were. Another innovation that came later, and someone just came up to me and thanked me, and thank you to him, was we set up something called the ITAG-G, which is like the White House Fellows. It's a fellows program attached to the NCTC for law enforcement, state and local law enforcement. We did that because it's important that the products prepared at the federal level have input from state and local officials and are in a form that is understandable to first responders. Makes no sense to produce all this stuff that they can't use. There's a huge network of very capable law enforcement folks out there, and certainly my view, and I'm sure Joe shares this, is they're much more likely to uncover a plot against us than any one of the 40,000 FBI agents, or certainly any one of the 535 members of Congress. So putting this together, creating vertical, that is funny, I know, it really is funny. My fault. Creating the ability to have vertical information sharing in both directions, from local communities up and from the federal government and connected to our international intelligence agencies down, is still a work in progress. And if there's there are many big challenges. Another one is cyber security, cyber threats. But information sharing needs to continue to improve. Otherwise, there's no possible way we will, if and when, and it might be when, some new major attack is planned. Otherwise, we will not connect the dots in order to deter or prevent it.
Well, we had one of those examples of the imperfections earlier this year, didn't we, Senator? Because you've said that the Boston Marathon bombings were a failure of intelligence and cooperation, right? That the local police and the Massachusetts Homeland Security Agency was never informed by the FBI of suspicions regarding the Tsarnaev brothers. Is that correct?
That is true. I mean, I want to start with the really remarkably good news, which is that federal, state, local law enforcers have stopped almost 70 plots, terrorist plots to strike at different targets in the U.S. in the years, from within the U.S. in the years since 9/11. But there have been some failures, and I testified to that effect before a House committee after the Boston Marathon terrorist attacks, because basically, generally speaking, when a terrorist attack is carried out successfully, you've got to say, and this is a tough standard, that the Homeland Security system has failed. It's very hard in a country that's as big and free as ours to stop every terrorist attack, but that has to be our goal. In the particular case, in the Boston case, as we did an investigation, or actually I was no longer in, but I followed what was happening in different committees that did an investigation. You can see that at different times, and I know hindsight is always clear, but you could see that at different times if information had been shared, you wonder, couldn't we have stopped it? And I'll be real brief about this, but as you probably remember, maybe don't from that time, Russian intelligence notified the US intelligence that one of the Chernayev brothers was going to Dagestan and hanging out with known terrorists. Well, that information, basically, long story short, was not ultimately shared with local law enforcement in Boston. The FBI went and interviewed the Chernayevs and watched them for a while, but came away feeling that there was nothing there. They never told the local police in Boston or any of the leaders in the Muslim community. Incidentally, one of the Chernayevs, as you may recall, was thrown out of his mosque because they thought he was an extremist and they didn't want him there. And I think and then there was another case where he was on, because of the initial Russian intelligence and its presence on one watch list, the system pinged, so to speak, with part of Homeland Security when the Chernayev left to go to Dagestan. But that ping was never shared with the Joint Terrorism Task Force in Boston or with the local police. I mean, long story short, it wouldn't have been easy. This is hard, but I think that if the system had really worked 100%, then we could have stopped those 4 people from being killed and so many others from being maimed. And this actually raises another problem which the system is trying to deal with. And here again, I use a metaphor which is admittedly too simplistic. I said on 9/11, we concluded that the dots were not all on the same board, so they couldn't be connected. We have done so well at gathering information and creating systems in the 12 years since then that the metaphor that I would use is that sometimes there are now so many dots on the board that people in the system have trouble separating all of them out to find the significant ones, or put it another way, there's so many dots on the board that they can't always connect the dots that really should be connected. And in a way, that's what happened in the Boston massacre case.
Could I just add one thing about that? And maybe Joe and I disagree slightly. I don't think there is such a thing as 100% security. We'll never get there. Listen up, folks. We'll get closer, but we'll never get there. The terrorists or others who would attempt violent behavior have to be right once. We have to be right 100% of the time. They attack us asymmetrically. That means they exploit us where we're weak. And I think the best way to frame what we need to do is we need to manage risk. We need to prioritize what's important. We need very well prepared and informed local law enforcement, which we have. Certainly we have in Colorado. We need fusion centers. Colorado's fusion center was voted best in the country in 2010. And we need, we need a well-prepared public, and that's something I know under a new program the governor's just started here. You're all going to be. You're the ones who will notice first if something's strange in your families, if something's going on with your neighbors. And the notion isn't to spy on each other, but the notion is if we see something, we should say something. And we need a system that can intake that and sort through it and come up with the most likely risks and manage against that. And a few will get through. I just would make one other comment on Boston. I agree that the fact that the FBI was notified by Russian authorities should have got more attention. The FBI should have told the Boston Police Department that the Tsarnaev brother was on this so-called tied list. But I think that the response by local law enforcement and the entire community in Massachusetts and connected federally was magnificent. And in about 36 hours, using surveillance cameras and people's personal cell phone pictures, the 2 bombers were identified and captured shortly thereafter. So I'd give us about B- on the front end, which isn't a good enough grade, but an A on the back end, and then add to that that the community of Boston was so resilient and so resolved to become a stronger community. It says a lot, and it says a lot about America that 12 years after 9/11, we're all sitting here together remembering a tragedy, but absolutely resolved together to build a stronger country.
You know, I want to just add to what Jane said, and it's really important that the extraordinary response to the Boston attacks wasn't an accident. They had drilled for it. This is part of the relationship that was created between federal, state, and local Homeland Security first responders. They had drilled specifically at the Boston Marathon site. So I think a lot of people's lives were saved that day, not only because of the heroism of just citizens who were there, which we all witnessed, but because of the readiness of the first responders. And I'm glad you pointed that out. Incidentally,
hey, I'd like to see some, I see something.
Yeah. I want to go back to domestic terrorism threats in just 1 second, but I'd like just a quick reaction, and I don't want to spend too much time on it because the Cell actually devoted an entire forum to this topic in July, but I think we'd be remiss if we didn't at least touch on it very briefly. And that is this whole issue that's been in the news in the last few months regarding NSA metadata gathering and whether it impinges, encroaches on Fourth Amendment rights, on rights of privacy. As I said, I don't want to spend a lot of time. The Cell's done some great work on this, but I was just curious about each of your opinions regarding that. Are you troubled by it? Do you agree with Representative Sensenbrenner, for example, who was one of the sponsors of the Patriot Act, that he didn't foresee all this, or do you think it's within the realm of our constitutional rights?
Well, I think it is very important to protect our Constitution. I also think it's important to protect the security of America. And I don't see security and liberty as a zero-sum game. I think it's a positive-sum game. We get more of both or we get less of both. And I was there, Joe was too, but I was on the Intelligence Committee as we considered what to do in terms of these surveillance programs after 9/11. I was part of the so-called Gang of Eight, the chairman and the ranking member of the House and Senate Intelligence Committees and the leadership of the House and Senate, that adds up to 8, are briefed, read in, so-called read into some of our deepest secrets in this country. And I was in briefings in the Situation Room in the White House and learned about this program, the early versions of this program, the telephone program. Which was the first program that the Bush administration created. Problem with it in the early years, which I didn't understand from the briefings, was that it was constructed through the President's Commander-in-Chief authorities outside of the law Congress had passed, Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which passed in 1978 to correct some of the abuses of the prior Nixon administration. And to protect the security of Americans. That's where the FISA court was created. That's when the intelligence committees were created. And the notion was, and still is, that if the content of an American's telephone call or email is going to be revealed to the federal government, there needs to be an individualized warrant. And that's what the FISA court is for. And that's what the First Amendment requires. And when we discovered in Congress that this program was being conducted outside of FISA, a huge effort was made to amend FISA because obviously there weren't cell phones in 1978. There weren't the whole cell system that we have now. To amend FISA so that it would apply to American citizens in the way I've described, whether they're in America or they're abroad. That was actually an expansion of protection for Americans. It's still not perfect, and revelations that have come out of the Snowden leaks have shown all of us how these programs work and have generated a public debate, which I applaud, And I think the goal now should be to make certain that there are the protections that the law is supposed to guarantee, and if there aren't, that the law works better. And I applaud, for example, a proposal that President Obama has espoused, which is to put an ombudsman in the FISA court to make sure that individual liberties are protected. And I also support some suggestions by Senator Feinstein, Dianne Feinstein of California, who chairs that Senate Intelligence Committee, to put limits on, to create reports about how much data there is, put limits, further limits on how long it can be kept, and to make certain that to a maximum extent the American people understand and buy into the programs that are designed to make certain that foreigners are not intending to attack our country and to prevent and deter attacks when we discover them.
Senator, would you like to add anything?
Well, I want to add much because I agree with just about everything Jane said. I mean, basically these NSA programs and the capabilities that NSA has have played a critical role in protecting us from terrorist attacks since they were created. We also created systems that Jane described to protect people's rights, constitutional rights. And to the best of my knowledge from what I've seen, they work pretty well to do that. I think some of the reform ideas are good ideas. I like the idea in the FISA court and in the private court, because you can't make these appeals in public because they are about classified matters. There is a thought, right now the government presents the case to the judges. There is a thought that President Obama has raised and others to create essentially what you might call a public defender, to be there in the court to make the case if he thinks or she thinks that civil liberties or privacy are implicated or are violated by the particular warrant being sought. I think that's a good idea, but basically, listen, let's say the other thing here. We're arguing about this, it's what makes our country great, even when people stand up in groups like this and start shouting out, but not too much. I don't want to endorse that. I don't want to encourage anybody else. But I can tell you, I can tell you that there are other great countries in the world today which have similar capacities. I don't think they're as great as the NSA, which don't have civil liberties concerns and are carrying out some of the exact same functions without any systems or any regard for the civil liberties or privacy of their citizens. So, you know, it could be better, and we'll make it better.